I don't think it's very likely we would get our skeleton by chance. It starts out not as bone. When we're in the womb developing, our skeleton really begins as cartilage. Same kind of tissue we have in our nose and ear. It's rubbery, it's flexible. And cartilage is an unusual tissue in that it does not tolerate blood. It's completely anaerobic, so there's no blood supply to cartilage. And this turns out to be a good thing because we have cartilage in our joints that allow the joints to move smoothly. And if cartilage required blood vessels, the cartilage in our joints is kind of rubbery. When the weight of our body pushed on these joints, it would squeeze the blood vessels. That would not be good for the tissue, but cartilage, in fact, doesn't have any blood vessels, doesn't require blood supply, and produces these marvelously silent joints that we have that make no noise as we move. And the lubrication is all automatic, too. Bone is a fascinating tissue. If you grow bone cells in tissue culture, like in a dish, they'll make some little amorphous piece of bone, but it'll almost always have a marrow space. So marrow goes with bone. And of course, marrow has a really very different function of making red blood cells, white blood cells. But the two really do go together. Bone is not static. You need to think of like girders in a building or concrete. The ancients used to think of bone as being like pottery, but we know that bone is alive. It's just as alive as your heart or your liver. And it's able to change. It can change its shape. It can change its density, depending on how you use it. If you go into outer space and you float around weightless for 6 months, as some people have done, a great deal of bone mass is lost. And sometimes it takes quite a while to get that mass back if it's lost over too long a period of time. So bone changes as we use it. A lot of the detail you see in a bone was not there genetically when you were born. Certain bumps and ridges develop because of tendons pulling on the bone. We have a bump behind our ear here that you can feel. It's called the Mastoid Process. And that bump's not there when you're a baby first born. There's a muscle in your neck that goes from your sternum up to your skull, basically makes your head go up. So when a baby's born and they work on getting their head up, the pulling of that muscle, called the sternocleidomastoid, causes bone mass to build up to resist having the tendon pulled out. So a lot of the detail, a lot of the bumps and ridges on bones are formed because of the way the bone is used, and the bone density is based on what kind of load are we putting on our bones. In fact, every part of our body is turning over all the time. This is something people don't realize. We often ask somebody, how old they are, and by that we usually mean when was their birthday, how many years has it been since then. But old can mean something else, too. For example, a fellow had an old broad axe over his fireplace, and people would ask, where'd he get that broad axe? He said, that belonged to my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And then he would be asked, how old is that axe? And he said, well, I understand that it's been passed down through the family over about 300 years. But I also understand that over the years, it's had 6 new heads and 12 new handles. So how old would you say the axe is? Would you go by the 300 years when it was purchased, or would you go by the last combination of head and handle as its age? If you go by the latter, my age is 15. Statistically, it's estimated we really don't get over 15 years old any part of our body. It will have been replaced at least once, statistically, in 15 years. So that our skin, the epidermis, turns over in about 28 days or 1 month. If we didn't see one another for a month, the whole surface would be brand new. And only a month old. Lining of our GI tract turns over in 4 days. Fastest turnover in the body. Red blood cells turn over in 120, white blood cells in about 2 weeks. You can go through the whole body this way. The only thing that really isn't turning over is the central nervous system, the brain. and heart muscle doesn't repair or turn over, not as cells, but both the brain and heart muscle can turn over molecule by molecule, so there is some replacement there too. But what this means is it's not at all remarkable that Methuselah lived to be 1,000 years old. 15, that's not bad. Assuming his body is like ours, it's turning over all the time. So we have this constant turnover and repair. I kind of suspect before the fall into sin of Adam and Eve that maybe it wasn't necessary to turn over or replace parts of the body. We know the children of Israel wandered 40 years in the desert and their sandals didn't wear out. So if God doesn't want something to wear out, it doesn't. But certainly after the fall, we have to be a product of a constant turnover and replacement. There are details about the bone a lot of people never think about, but you can take a piece of bone that's dead, maybe pick up some bone that's still fairly fresh looking but dead, and if you bend it, it generates electric currents. And it's a physical phenomenon known as a piezoelectric. Piezoelectrics are where you have two different kinds of crystals in close association that have a different availability of electrons. And when you bend these two crystals, they generate current in microamp ranges. Bone is a piezoelectric, and it's believed that piezoelectrics in bone may be responsible for the bone's ability to respond to the different loads that we put on bone. If you put more load on bone, the bone builds up mass to resist that extra load. On the other hand, if you lay in bed and may be ill for a year or so, there can be a dramatic loss of bone density. So how does the bone know when and where to add bone and remove bone? Because you see, we have two kinds of cells in bone. One is a bone maker. We call it an osteoblast. It makes a kind of almost like a plaster material. We call it osteoid, that at first is soft. It has an affinity for calcium salts and becomes hard, sort of setting up like plaster. But then we have a bone breaker too, or a remover. It's called the osteoclast. And you need both, because as a bone is growing, say, in length and width from the size of, say, our femur and as a newborn baby until we get to be an adult, it's not enough just to keep adding bone to the surface to make that femur bigger. You would end up with a very small marrow space. So to keep the marrow space proportionately sized to the bone, as the bone's growing on the outside, you have to have some way of drilling out the inside of the bone. And that's accomplished by osteoclasts. So the osteoblast and the clast work in concert. When you're young and you're growing and getting bigger, the osteoblasts are working faster than the osteoclasts. When you reach full growth, where you're not going to get taller anymore, then they kind of take turns. The osteoclast removes some bone and the osteoblast puts it back. And you might wonder, why would you want to do that? Leave well enough alone. Well, again, that's repairing microfractures that can occur in the small interstices of the bone. And so by turning it over, just like turning over the other parts of our body, bone doesn't really age either. It reaches a certain age and that's it. So it's a dynamic turnover, and it has to be under control. When a lady becomes pregnant and has 20 pounds of weight with baby and amniotic fluid, the bones of the hips and the legs and everything actually remodel to best support that weight. And that's true even inside the bone, where we have spongy bone, little tiny beams that are in the interior of the bone. They even orient a little different to accommodate this weight. Then when the baby's delivered, the bones will then model back to whatever their original configuration was. Another interesting thing about that is it's very difficult to avoid osteoporosis by simply taking in more calcium, because your intestines simply won't absorb the extra calcium you're trying to consume. But if a lady becomes pregnant, now the skeleton of the baby has to be built, and the intestinal tract of the mother will now start absorbing more calcium than it would otherwise absorb, not for the benefit of the mother, but to build the skeleton of the baby. Oh, it's a million things like this that leave me in a position where I'd have to say it would not be possible for me to believe in evolution.